we just cannot trust these tech companies anymore, that they are no longer able to govern because they have amassed so much power that is not just economic power, it is geopolitical power, it is cultural power, societal, political power, that they just cannot responsibly handle. It's important for us to remember that the Chinese state-driven model does not mean that the state always predates. First of all, I find the developments in India fascinating. The digital public infrastructure is a really intriguing model that shows that India is not within the sphere of any of the three digital empires that I am describing.
History suggests that it's the winners who shape the rules of any game. And if we are living through what I've called the Green Tech game, and Europe wants to continue to shape the game, it's also got to play the game.
One of the reasons that the US has been so much more successful than EU is that they are recruiting from the global talent. Immigration from India is a huge part of the tech success story of the US companies. And I think that is one issue that the Europeans just have not really exploited. We are not going to see peace anytime soon. There's enough of geopolitical tension, distrust, and the rivalry that will keep the battles alive, especially the US-China tech war.
Welcome to today's episode of the Great Tech Game podcast, where we bring you smart, insightful, big picture conversations about the intersection of technology, geopolitics, business, policy, that will explain to you the big picture of how technology is shaping the world. And today I'm delighted to have with me Professor Anu Bradford, who's a professor of law at Columbia Law School. She's a fellow Harvard alum. She's a fellow non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. But I guess most importantly, she is author of two amazing books. The first one being The Brussels Effect, How the EU Rules the World, which came out, I believe, in 2020 and was named one of the best books of 2020 by Foreign Affairs. And more recently, her newest book, Digital Empires, The Global Battle to Regulate Technology, which was named one of the best books by Financial Times in 2023. So I'm delighted to have you with us here today, Anu.
Well, Anirudh, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
As am I. We're going to get right into our conversation. There's lots I want to try and cover with you today, largely basis your book, The Digital Empires, but I'm sure we'll also touch upon some of the themes that you've written about in the Brussels Effect and other work you've done. I want to get started with the idea of digital empires. For many who might hear that term, people might think of the big tech firms that are often called tech empires today. But I know you are referring to different entities when you're talking about the digital empires in your book. So why don't you tell us, just get us started with a little bit about the book, the digital empires, the concept, and the different regulatory approaches that underlie the approaches these three empires you've written about have taken.
So great. I actually do ask in the book at some point whether we should be thinking about these tech companies being more impactful than the states themselves. So whether they are ultimately the true digital empires. But you're absolutely right. The primary framework is this idea that we have three predominant jurisdictions that are the leading technological or regulatory powers that are shaping our digital world. So I talk about the US and China and the European Union. And I argue that they offer three different ways to think about technology regulation that are based on different ideologies, cultural traditions, and political preferences. So we have the American market-driven model, the Chinese state-driven model, and the European, what I call a rights-driven model as a way to think about technology regulation. So if I walk you quickly through the basic assumptions underlying each of these models. So the American market-driven model is really prioritizing free market, free speech, free internet incentives to innovate. So it reserves a very trivial role for the government and in practice hands over the governance of technology to the tech companies themselves. China, on the other hand, is very focused on making China a technological superpower, and it's prepared under its state driven model to deploy state resources to meet that goal. But at the same time, the Chinese government is using technology as a means to pursue surveillance and propaganda and censorship in an effort to entrench the political power of the Communist Party and ensure social stability within the nation. So, where do the Europeans fit in this picture? Because many describe the Europeans as being left to choose between the Chinese digital world and the American digital world because they don't have a robust technology industry on their own. So, in Digital Empires, I argue that Europe is a digital empire on its own right. It is not able to, nor is it forced to, choose between China and the US, because the Chinese model for the Europeans, understandably, is too oppressive. But the American model is too permissive. So the Europeans have now pioneered their own third way for to govern digital economy, and I call that a rights-driven regulatory model. It is a governance approach where the protection of fundamental rights of individuals take a center stage alongside the preservation of democratic structures of the society. And it also encapsulates a notion of a fairer digital economy, where the Europeans are prepared to redistribute power away from the large tech companies to smaller companies, to individual users, and to the society at large. So, Anirudh, those are the three primary ways that I use to structure our conversation on the different ways we might think about regulating the digital economy.
Yeah, and that's great, Anu. I wanted you to lay those out, but really the question I want to get to is, since you've written the book as well, but even otherwise, this field of tech regulation and the way countries are thinking about their tech policy and their tech strategies is evolving very, very dynamically. And so the question for you is, how are you seeing these three approaches, which you've laid out, I think, really nicely in contrast with each other? How are they changing? How is the US trying to evolve its approach to maybe try and be more human centric, or try to be a country that's trying to keep a more level playing field and not let power get concentrated in the hands of a few? How are the Chinese maybe adapting their state driven strategy to make sure that they remain innovative? And how maybe the Europeans trying to adapt their strategy so that they don't remain purely a regulatory superpower, but can also become leaders in the tech innovation or the tech development side. So, walk us through how you see all three of them seeing and adapting their tech strategies basis what they're seeing the other powers do.
Yes, I think that's a great question, Anirudh, because none of these models are stable in the sense that we wouldn't see any dynamic forces pushing these countries to reassess some of the initial commitments. So, the US, for instance, it is not that we never see the state enter the tech sphere. There are deep concerns about national security that has always justified a role for the state in the economy. And right now, in the current geopolitical environment, one could say that the US is actually moving away from many of its market driven commitments in an effort to fight the tech war with China. So we see export controls and investment restrictions, where many would say that the US is playing Beijing's game. We see subsidies. This is no longer just a full
It's the
commitment to
new
free
age
market.
industrial policy back in play. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the main battlefield there is technology. So I think this is one thing we see. So there's partially the geopolitical pressures that are pushing the state more into the center of the tech development, but also then there's an increase in consciousness in the United States that we just cannot trust these tech companies anymore, that they are no longer able to govern left to their own devices because they have amassed so much power that is not just economic power, it is geopolitical power, it is cultural power, societal, political power that they just cannot responsibly handle. And these companies have failed us repeatedly and spectacularly. And American people no longer really are committed to this techno libertarian worldview that would view these companies as only providing benefits for them. So, in addition, there's also an increasing consciousness in the US that we need to regulate because these companies are not just providing products and services that are beneficial for individuals and societies, but that are outright harmful and that compromise the rights of individuals. So if you now look at the conversation in the US, there's a lot of resentment and distrust against these tech companies. And increasingly, American people want the state to regulate, to protect their privacy, to make sure that we are not surrounded by disinformation and hate speech online, to rediscover the power of antitrust laws, to make sure that these companies don't abuse their power in the marketplace. So this is just an example how in the US we see a shift away from the market-driven model towards the European rights-driven model, but also with elements of state playing a role like we see in the Chinese model. And we can also see then these shifts in the Chinese model, in the European model that I'm happy to walk through as well.
How is the Chinese one evolving, in your opinion? Of course, people in the West have always said that the Chinese model, as you've also said in your book, is a very state-driven tech economy with a lot of control and a lot of socio-political priorities being embedded in the various tech companies and the work they do. Even in the field of AI today, if you look at the LLMs coming out of China, there's a sense in the West that the CCP is trying to make sure that the outputs coming out of these LLMs, adhere to the socio-political objectives of the CCP, etc. But how are they adapting or maybe incorporating some of the strengths of the US model, let's say, on the innovation side, into their model? Or are you seeing them not adapt that much?
Yeah, I think it's important for us to remember that the Chinese state-driven model does not mean that the state always prevails. So even if you think about the origins of the growth of the Chinese tech companies, all these tech giants that China has generated, it is not only with the help of subsidies from Beijing. These companies have benefited from tremendous venture capital, including American venture capital. So there's always been a sense that the Chinese are prepared to harness the power of the markets to fuel the growth of the industry, and how innovative economy is central for the country to grow and for the country to provide the kind of benefits through economic growth that has always been important for the Chinese government to make sure that the economy can grow and provide the kind of benefits for the individuals that helps legitimize the Communist Party's control of the society. So the Chinese government has never been able to afford to forego this important goal around economic growth that needs to be reconciled with the goals around political control. And exactly now in the era of AI, even though you absolutely are right in saying how the LLMs need to then not also they need to be taught how not to speak and not only how to speak. So there's important that the message of the Chinese Communist Party is not undermined by generative AI. But there's also this need to let the AI develop so that the Chinese will retain their technological supremacy in these important domains so they can ensure that economic growth goals are being met. So there's this persistent tension between how much control can the government exert without then undermining the very important goal around economic growth.
And if you look at how the US government, let's say, or the state, has been leveraging the big tech firms, right? There's some very clear examples that have emerged where now the US government is also using the strengths of big tech firms that are American big tech firms to further their own geopolitical objectives as well, right? So Ukraine has been a great example. You've seen Starlink, you've seen Microsoft come to the cyber defense of Ukraine, and many such examples we can discuss. So to play devil's advocate for a second, how different are these models actually? Because when it comes to geopolitical power projection or foreign policy goals, it seems that the US state is also not hesitating to leverage the strength of its big tech firms. If you look at the Chinese, when it comes to digital infrastructure, companies like Huawei, submarine cables, 5G infrastructure, and so on and so forth, the Chinese government also seems to be very much leveraging its big tech firms and supporting them as well. So, how different really are the two models actually?
So I think there are many important similarities. And as I mentioned earlier, the US in many ways is playing Beijing's game.
Or is Beijing playing the US game? Because the Beijing viewpoint sometimes is that we've seen the military industrial complex do wonders for the US over the last several decades. And in this new tech industrial world, it's almost the tech industrial equivalent of the military industrial complex, right? So, aren't they learning from the US in many ways?
Yeah, so both are deploying their tech companies to pursue geopolitical goals. But I would say that the relationship between the government and these companies still remains very different in both places. So if you think about the Chinese tech companies, when they get an order from the Chinese Communist Party, they know who is in charge. They don't take the government to independent courts in China and contest what is needed of them. Whereas if you see the US tech companies, yes, Edward Snowden told the whole world that sometimes the government is getting data that they need from these tech companies, but we also see massive litigation that these tech companies deploy when they are defending their rights to stick to their encryption policies, to fight the government orders, to give them data that they would need as part of law enforcement investigations. So we still see much more contestation. We see lobbying by these tech companies against regulation in very prominent way. And in the US democratic system, the government officials, the members of Congress, they need the money to win the elections. A lot of the money comes from these tech companies. The tech companies know it, and they are willing to deploy the political power they have. It is a very different dynamic in the Chinese authoritarian system. So, yes, I think we see similarities that we need to acknowledge. But at the same time, we should not lose sight of the very different dynamic of how a free democratic society works and how the relationships between the private sector and the government are constructed under the digital authoritarian model of China.
Yeah. And so now, I think one of the key things that I got out of your book also is that I think even in my book, The Great Tech Game, I think one of my main endeavors when I talked about the tech driven geopolitical, geoeconomic competition that we are living through now was to say that this is not purely a US China game, that this almost Cold War esque framework that sometimes people use to describe today's tech battles, that it's either the US or the Chinese model, is flawed. That this is really a global dynamic with various players around the world that are emerging that might shape the way not just technology is regulated, but also how tech is developed, right? And I think you speak about the European Union as that third way, as you've just articulated as well. But the fourth one that I want to briefly touch upon is the one we've briefly spoken about, which is the Indian one, right? I think India, in many ways, in a similar position as Europe. I describe both Europe and India in my book as the digital challengers. If the US and China today are the tech superpowers or the digital superpowers of our world, I see the European Union and India as the two challengers who often have some of the basic foundations of I would say tech competitiveness, but are not necessarily the superpowers in these arenas yet for various reasons. And at the same time, even from a tech policy standpoint, are trying to develop and evolve their own ways, right? You've described a little bit about the European way. And then there's this emerging idea that India has also been thinking about and now articulating and developing, which is sometimes people are calling it the India way, refers to basically this set of technologies called the India stack or digital public infrastructure or digital public goods that for almost now the last 10 to 15 years India has been developing, right? I think you're familiar with them, the Aadhaar, the Universal ID, and all the different other sectors that now that set of technologies is being applied to beyond financial technologies in healthcare, education, agriculture now, etc. Where India is saying that much like the Europeans, we don't want concentration of power in just a few firms. Definitely not a few firms that are just in one or two geographies, right? At the same time, we don't want the data that is being generated by people, by consumers, to be owned by someone else. We want people who are generating the data to also have a consent-based architecture for access to that data. And at the same time, we want to have a level playing field for any entrepreneur, any startup, to be able to build applications, innovative applications on top of that data commons in a way, right? So India's building out this digital data infrastructure layer upon which then a fintech company can build out a payments application, a healthcare company can build out a healthcare application, an edtech company can build out edtech application basis this digitally publicly available or publicly accessible data. And so I wanted to ask you your view on one, whether you see a need for a fourth way in the first place, and whether the European models and the Indian models are similar enough to be maybe considered a third way, but maybe
Yeah.
just with a European perspective and an Indian perspective.
Yeah. So first of all, I find the developments in India fascinating. The digital public infrastructure is a really intriguing model. And I think it has some of its distinct features that show that India is not within the sphere of any of the three digital empires that I am describing. I am not sure whether I would say that India is a fourth model, but in many ways, I think it is a hybrid model where it does take on elements of the other models, yet also layers on the top of that some of its very idiosyncratic features, including what it has done on the DPI. And the DPI may be one of the exports of the Indian hybrid model that may resonate in many other markets of the world. But if we take data privacy as an example, I would say that India is not a model on its own. It incorporates many of the elements of the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, from Europe, but then it adds very Chinese type sort of features of data localization. Those are very state controlled elements that you don't find in the GDPR. It probably does reflect the direction to where many of the countries are moving in data flows when the trust in the global marketplace and the free flow of data is dissipating in many ways. But I think that's an example where the Indian model would be a hybrid of a European with some elements of a state driven model. I think one can say that same in the content moderation space, that there is a certain commitments that India or certain practices in India that make it hard to reconcile with sort of today's European commitment to freedom of expression in a way that Indian model sometimes deviates from some of the basic features that you find in the European model, but it is not certainly the Chinese digital authoritarian content moderation model. There's no censorship in the way that you see censorship in China. So I think it's fair to, and one could portray India as a fourth model, or then one can show that India is an example how large, significant countries with technological and regulatory capability on their own, they are not simply within the sphere of an influence of any given empire, but that they are able to play this off one another and also then depart themselves from the features that any of these three empires offer when they feel that they have an independent view that serves the needs of that country particularly well. And I think India's digital public infrastructure is a very good example of that.
Yeah, yeah. And I want to move now to a slightly different but I think related topic, which is something that I call the tug of war between states and big tech firms in my own book, The Great Tech Game, but I think you've called them as vertical battles and horizontal battles, where the relationship between states and big tech firms is, I think, again, a very fast evolving dynamic. It's not as clear cut as many people think. There are times when big tech firms and governments are collaborating a lot, sometimes where they are at odds with each other, and sometimes internationally big tech firms will have a different relationship with foreign governments, but a different relationship maybe with their home governments. So there's many different ways in which this relationship between big tech firms and governments is panning out around the world. But I wanted to ask you your view of how you are seeing these, what you've called the vertical battles and the horizontal battles, playing out.
Yeah, so I think conceptually it is helpful for us to think about these two levels of battles. So horizontal battles are battles between the states, the empires. So the US China tech war, or the US EU regulatory battles over privacy versus surveillance, or antitrust or digital taxation. But I think what is interesting that at the same time when these digital empires are battling one another, they are fighting vertical battles within their jurisdictions against the tech companies. So these are the states versus tech companies who ultimately shapes the digital economy and society, and to which direction. And there I think the interesting insight in my view is that these two levels of battles are interlinked. So if you think about, we talked a little bit about how the Americans are now reassessing their commitment to the market-driven model, the value of techno-libertarianism and techno-optimism, and are considering engaging increasingly into these vertical battles to go after their tech companies on the grounds of privacy or antitrust, or then revisiting the commitment to free speech online. But any of these vertical battles then take place in the shadow of that big horizontal battle against China, which makes it
Bigger
very difficult.
geopolitical, the bigger geopolitical battle that the US is engaged in. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that makes it very hard for the US government to go all the way, because it's very conscious that if it is too aggressive in its vertical battle against the tech companies, it is eroding the very asset, the power of these tech companies that it needs in the horizontal battle against China. So these interlinkages introduce what I call an element of restraint into these battles. And ultimately, that's why we see the periods of escalation alternate with periods of de escalation as well.
And is your sense that that's going to be true around the world? So, of course, the US has this primary geopolitical competitor that is top of mind, top of policy agenda for the US policymakers. And that's why, as you've said, there's a certain element of restraint that will come in. But do you think that's big tech firms will be able to also play governments off each other globally in order to make sure that they continue to get favorable environments, whether it comes to taxation or generally more broadly regulation? Because, of course, a lot of countries around the world are seeing the presence of big tech firms, whether it's an Ireland or a UAE, and you can name many such what I call digital entrepots, the equivalent of
Yeah.
trading entrepots back in the trading era that we've lived through, where they are rushing to make sure that they provide the most conducive environments to big tech firms. And so big tech firms are saying, okay, fine, if I'm going to get heavily taxed in one jurisdiction, let me find another jurisdiction that doesn't come down so heavily on me. If I'm going to get heavily regulated on XYZ technological pieces, let's say around LLMs or content moderation, let me see if I can, again, base some of my engineering workforce somewhere else, and so on and so forth. So is your sense that the big tech firms will be able to play governments of each other around the world? Or is your sense that the governments are now starting to coordinate and get their acts together globally in order to make sure that these global big tech firms, right, are not able to play them off against each other?
So I'm not as convinced that the governments are successfully collaborating. We see actually pretty weak efforts to align these different regulatory frameworks. So international cooperation is not exactly strong at this very time. We see attempts to pursue some degree of cooperation between the US and the EU, but ultimately we're pretty far from aligning the regulatory approaches. I also don't think that these tech companies are particularly successful in playing off these governments against one another or taking advantage of these loopholes. So in Europe, it doesn't matter where you are established as a company, you cannot evade the GDPR if you are processing European data. And you have attempts to move to jurisdictions with low taxation. There's a reason why most of these tech companies are headquartered in Ireland, but they are litigating now state aid allegations by the European Commission because they have benefited from favorable tax treatment in Ireland. So, in many ways, these tech companies have been most successful in the US because of their lobbying power to fend off regulation. They are not able to go against the Chinese Communist Party and say, we want to do it our way. They have two options in China: they capitulate or they stay out. And that's why many of these companies have stayed out. There is no Facebook in China. There is no censored Google search engine in China because they cannot have their regular search engine. And there was too much of a backlash when they wanted to develop a Chinese censored search engine. Apple has chosen to largely capitulate. It is making many compromises to its commitment to fundamental right to data privacy because it wants to stay in the Chinese market. So there, I think the tech companies really are limited in their ability to play off these governments. And there are many examples I discuss in the book where the tech companies are in a bind, where they actually cannot at the same time comply with the demands of two conflicting regulatory regimes. So I talked about how the Chinese Uber Didi listed in New York Stock Exchange and ultimately was forced to delist. And many Chinese companies are facing demands for greater transparency. So they need to submit more information to the US regulators who want the US based investors have a full understanding what's happening in the regulatory front that these companies are facing. But the Chinese government tells them not to hand over that very information that the
That's
Americans want them to hand over.
yeah.
And the same happens with the privacy, that we have examples where US companies are asked to hand over some data as part of a law enforcement investigation in the US. The data is located in the European servers where the GDPR tells them not to
Not
hand
to.
over that data. So, in many ways, we see these intractable battles where the tech companies need to choose which market they actually are then staying on and be more committed to.
No, that's fascinating. I think those are great examples to show how often I think now geopolitics is shaping the future of these tech firms in many ways. And in an earlier podcast conversation, I was talking to a historian who's looked at empires in the past, examples like the East India Company and the British Crown. And one of the insights that had come out in that conversation was that sometimes the East India Company, for example, during the colonial era, would align itself with the British Crown, when it came to the British geopolitical battle with France at the time. But then at the same time, whenever it could, it would find ways to evade complying with British geopolitical policy through a whole set of one can call sneaky ways, or different innovative ways like subsidiaries and you know creating offshoots in different African countries, and then claiming to not have that much control over them, whereas one can argue that they probably did. Are you seeing that today's big tech firms, whether it's the American ones or the Chinese ones, are they finding ways to evade the diktats in a way of the geopolitical imperatives of the countries that they are, I guess, hosted in?
I would say no. I think they're at the heart of it. They are the targets, they are the tools. This fight happens with using them as proxies. I think in many ways they are central players, or they sort of set of options are shaped by these geopolitical constraints. And in many ways, these US tech companies, they are now suffering massive commercial losses because of the limits that the US government is imposing in their ability to take advantage of commercial opportunities in the Chinese market. So it is very hard for them to skillfully evade, though I think there's some evidence that they evade them. So NVIDIA is told not to hand over some kind of chips. So they develop different chips that are right below the thresholds that don't
That's right.
hit the export control restrictions. And then the government can go and shift its own regulatory policy, widen the scope of the particular
And
technology.
of course, to add, no, absolutely, I think that NVIDIA example is a good one. And of course, to add to it, there's not a clear like chain here that says who's the end customer, right? And there's a lot of talk now about there being a black market in some of these advanced chips. NVIDIA or any other company today might be selling their most advanced chips to X. But the question then is, will X then possibly sell it off to Y, sell it off to Z? And you don't know where that chips might not be the best example, but some of these technologies could end up still evading the geopolitical imperatives that the US might be imposing or the Chinese might be imposing.
Yeah, and we've seen that these sanctions, export controls have been far from perfect. So we still have evidence that either sanctions are leaking. There are different ways through third parties to still supply the chips to the entities that are not supposed to have access to these chips. So we always know that economic sanctions are very difficult. The tech war is very costly, so the incentive remains to continue to engage in these commercial transactions. And it's very hard to police them in a way that these restrictions would be airtight. So I think it's absolutely fair to say that we do see continuing attempts to circumvent them, sometimes successfully, which means that we see the continuing flows of commerce to some extent. But it's also, I think, fair to say that this has really unsettled the markets. There have been moves towards greater decoupling of the tech ecosystem as a result, and there has been and continue to be tremendous cost to these companies, to the economies on both sides of the tech war, the economies in the third countries affected by the tech war. And ultimately, these firms that are at the very center of this, they do see their opportunities dwindle, and these business models are forced to some extent change as a result.
Yeah, yeah. And so if I was to ask you to now maybe peep into a little bit in the future, let's say 3 to 5 years from now, how do you see these digital empires that you've spoken about shaping up? Do you expect more and more collisions? Do you expect them to figure out a way to coexist? What will this set of digital empires look like in your view 3 to 5 years from now?
Yeah. So I think we are not going to see peace anytime soon. I don't think we see there's enough of geopolitical tension, distrust, and the rivalry that will keep the battles alive, especially the US China tech war. I think it is prone to continue. But I also point to many reasons why we see restraint in this battle. These commercial entanglements between the two markets make full decoupling impossible. So ultimately, what is inevitable is this coexistence, even though it requires a lot of management, it is a costly coexistence. We see periods of escalation that I think lead to greater decoupling of aspects of the tech economy. But I don't see full decoupling being feasible for any party in this battle. So in many ways, I think we will see the continuation of what we are seeing right now. In the US EU domain, I think there are a couple of possibilities. So we may see greater alignment between the US and the EU, where the US is moving towards greater sort of European style tech regulation. So this is now what we see, these bill spending in US Congress. We see enforcement actions brought by the Federal Trade Commission and Department of Justice using antitrust laws. We see attempts to now regulate AI, the sweeping executive order by the Biden administration. So we see certain movement, and the movement is to the direction of Europe, as opposed to Europe moving towards the US. So there's that possibility of greater transatlantic alignment. There's also increasingly shared concern of the need to restrain the spread of Chinese digital authoritarianism. So for quite a while, the US was being very hawkish on China, whereas the Europeans were hedging. The Europeans have even deeper commercial engagement. The relationship with China, they are more dependent on the continuation of that trading relationship. But I think there was a shift in the European mindset, and I would really point to China's refusal to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That really changed the way the Europeans conceived the relationship with China. And I think that really gave the impetus for the Europeans to align more closely with the Americans with this sort of greater, more explicit anti-China policies as well. So the Europeans have joined many of these export restrictions, are also pursuing greater control over investment flows with China. So I think there is possibility to see greater transatlantic alignment. But look, we've got the presidential election coming in the US. There's a lot that we cannot fully predict on how smooth the transatlantic collaboration will be.
I was going to ask you exactly that. You almost read my mind. I was going to ask you whether election outcomes in both the US, but also this almost like, I mean, rightward shift in Europe as well. Do you think this rightward shift in Europe, if it continues to play out, will that have any impact on the EU tech strategy, tech policy?
I think the big question in the EU is not just sort of dependent on the election in the elections in the European Parliament or the national elections across the EU, but I think irrespective of how those elections will turn out, there is a fundamental question that the Europeans are facing: is how do they deal with the increasing national security threats to the continent? So there is now a push towards seeing everything through much more geopolitical lens. Building the national security apparatus and technology is absolutely central for that. But in the technology space, there's also a deeper sense of vulnerability to what is happening around the world. The idea that the Europeans are too dependent on both China and the United States. And certainly the former President Trump's comments that he would not necessarily respect the NATO's obligations to come to the defense of Europe has heightened that sense of insecurity and then the vulnerability vis-a-vis the US as well. So there is a push towards greater strategic autonomy. In the tech space, this means that the tech policy would be really seen through the lens of building European technological self-sufficiency, digital sovereignty, which now would also entail very different policies than what the Europeans were drafting in the era where we were just thinking about rights. So now there may be a need to rethink even the balance of data privacy and surveillance. If the Europeans feel that we do need to focus much more on the military threats that are very concrete and existential for Europe. So I think there's going to be a big questions around potential move towards techno-protectionism, sort of data localization, industrial policy, and how that is going to then shape and potentially pose a threat to the Europeans' rather exclusive focus on rights up until recently.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, the other interesting parallel, Anu, that I saw in some of your book and some of the conclusions you're drawing and things you're talking about. I call this the Great Tech Game, and somewhere you've mentioned also, maybe even in another podcast you did, is that Europe at some point also has to figure out how to play the game, right? Play the game from the perspective that, of course, regulation is one way to shape the direction of technology to be more human centric and rights focused. But at the same time, history suggests that it's the winners who shape the rules of any game, right? And if we are living through what I've called the Great Tech Game, and Europe wants to continue to shape the game, it's also got to play the game. And to play the game, it's got to become an innovation superpower again, a risk taking superpower again, and not just remain what it has done well now for several years, which is, as you've also called it, a regulatory rights focused superpower in a way. So I want to ask you this question then as a result, which is, do you anticipate that Europe can, especially given the geopolitical concerns we've discussed, the national security concerns we've discussed, the realization that the US, China, Russia, all of these are very dynamic moving pieces on the chessboard, and Europe has to figure out its own way, not just geopolitically but also economically. Do you anticipate that Europe is also going to start making that shift away from a regulatory superpower to more of a innovation driven superpower, to become a tech developer, to becoming a more of a risk taker? One of the things I mentioned in my book when I look at history is one of the ways that Europe originally becomes so prosperous during the colonial industrial era is through this element of risk taking, right? And it's funny to hear today, several hundred years later, to say, oh, Europe is actually not so much risk taking anymore. I think this is something you've said, right? It's almost like the strength that got Europe to win 200, 300 years ago is now a weakness as per you, right? So do you anticipate there being a shift here, or is that something that you feel is still too far off, given the continent is maybe just too comfortable where it is?
So I think Europe has no choice. There has to be a shift. I don't underestimate the importance of the EU being a regulatory superpower. I think it is a really important role that it plays in shaping its own digital destiny. But there doesn't need to be a trade-off. It's a false choice to either be the referee or the player. I think the EU can continue its commitment to rights-driven regulation, but that commitment cannot sap all the energy and attention from this other goal that it has to have at the center of its policymaking, which it needs to focus on the very pillars of a thriving digital tech ecosystem and make sure that it pursues the reforms that are needed for the Europeans to actually also innovate and not just regulate. So I focused on four aspects in particular that I emphasize in the book. It needs to complete the digital single market. Currently, the European tech companies cannot scale and grow in Europe because the market remains fragmented. The second, the Europeans need to complete the capital markets union. There is no deep, robust capital market akin to what exists in the US. It's harder to fund your tech innovations in the EU. Then, Anirudh, you're mentioning the risk taking. That is absolutely central for any disruptive innovations to take place. And currently, the culture, the attitudes, and the legal frameworks in Europe discourage such risk taking. Countries have some of the most punitive bankruptcy laws in the world. Failure is often fatal in Europe. So, how can you expect the tech entrepreneurs to make these risky bets if they know that they are done if the company fails? Whereas in Silicon Valley, failure, bankruptcies, it's a rite of passage. Then you go and raise more money and you get more money because you seem to be doing big things. And then the fourth thing, and this is, I think, really, really crucial. One of the reasons that the US has been so much more successful than EU is that they are recruiting from the global talent pool. Immigration is a huge, including immigration from India, is a huge part of the tech success story of the US companies. So over 50% of over $1 billion startups in the US have an immigrant founder. And I think that is
Absolutely.
one issue that the Europeans just have not really exploited, the idea that how do you make Europe the destination for the world's talent?
Yeah, and as I was doing the research for my own book, and one of the things I do in my book is to talk about the different kinds of strategies that different countries or regions will need to adopt. And for the European Union, one of the key things that had come out was one, the unified market that you've spoken about, the risk-taking piece, um, and of course this idea that talent has to come from around the world today, right? You've got to have some of the best talent coming in. So I agree. I think with the four pieces you've outlined as the formula for Europe to become a innovation-focused superpower, in addition to its regulatory strengths. But my question still remains: are you seeing signs that it'll happen? It's clear what needs to be done, right? I think not many people will disagree with your articulation. But the question is, are you seeing signs that this is going to actually happen soon enough? One. And second, is it going to happen at the European Union level? Or, as I'm seeing, there are signs almost that maybe the French might do it, maybe the Germans might do it in another way, maybe and maybe in clean tech, it could be some of the Scandinavian countries that are doing more innovation. So are you seeing it, one, signs of it happening? Second, are you seeing them happening soon enough? And third, are they going to be collective movements towards this? Or do you think individual nations might just try and take a different path?
Yeah. So those are very good questions. I would say where I see a shift is that we are seeing, probably too slowly, but we are seeing the end to complacency. So there is now a heightened sense of urgency that, and it's part of this idea of strategic autonomy and Europeans' vulnerability. So there is now increasingly a consensus that we do need to find a way to grow our tech economies. What I fear is that the narrative that is now dominating this conversation is industrial policy, that the Europeans are trying to solve this problem by leaning too heavily on the kind of French dirigist, let's build national champions, let's subsidize our industries. The Europeans there was a big press conference. We are putting over 40 billion into semiconductors. That's a lot of money for Europeans to no longer be 90%, but 80% dependent on foreign semiconductors. Look, I don't think the Europeans can subsidize their way into greater competitiveness. That's why I talk about those issues, the digital markets, the completion of the digital single market, the capital markets union, the risk taking, immigration. That is a different path than just heavy reliance of industrial policy. And I'm not saying that there's the industrial policy thinking is all wrong. I am just worried that one can overdo it in the way that it will be absolutely inefficient and counterproductive. So, do I see that there is a some momentum in these other domains? I think you're right that we see some really encouraging signs in some member states. So yes, there are some exciting AI startups in markets like France. If
Mistral, for
you look,
example, right?
Mistral is very, very big. You certainly see, you see ASML in the Netherlands. There are some big successful European tech companies. The startup activity, if you look at the combined with Tallinn in Estonia, Helsinki in Finland, Stockholm in Sweden, if you look at sort of per capita compared activities in the startup scene, they are thriving capitals for that. But I think we cannot do everything at the member state level because digital single market relies on European level commitment to remove those impediments that derive from member state inconsistencies, state conflicting regulatory frameworks, and so forth. The capital markets union, the whole idea, we do need to pool the capital available across the EU. That also cannot just be done at the member state level. Yes, there can be regulatory adjustment that make it easier for instance, pension funds to invest risk capital in the venture space. But ultimately, to have the depth and the breadth of the capital markets, we do need to do something at the union level. Immigration, again, it's not an EU level competence, but there's much that the EU can also do to try to facilitate the EU's ability to then bring the immigrants into the Europe. But that is going to be something that needs to be done together with the policies at the member state level.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's interesting. I think you mentioned AI, you mentioned Mistral, and I think one of the interesting threads I'm seeing there is even in the US, there's now this debate that are we, with the rise of OpenAI and other such AI players that are again very heavily aligned with often with some of the big tech firms like Microsoft or Google or Meta, etc. There's a sense that okay, maybe even in the AI world there will not be a level playing field for startups. So this worry is there in the US as well. Hence, you've seen the rise in the articulation of the importance of the open source movement in the US. There's this battle going on, as I see it, between the open source LLMs and the closed ones, right? So Mistral, of course, like Llama 2 of Meta and others, is on the open source side, right? And I find it interesting that, if Mistral out of France takes an open source LLM approach, Meta takes an open source approach with Llama 2. If you look at India, we just had the Global Tech Summit here that Carnegie hosts in Delhi in December. And one of the things that was articulated there by some of the tech policy folks in India was that India should also move towards an open source LLM approach. And so the question then in my mind comes, and I wanted your view on this, is do you sense that there might be a alliance here or a international collaborative approach here to make sure that, let's say in a technology like AI, where there aren't the kind of large incumbents that exist, let's say in the consumer internet space, this time maybe earlier than later, we can make sure that there is a more level playing field? Or is your sense that these are still very disparate approaches and there isn't a sense of coordination around them?
So I probably view it a little bit differently. I do think there are existing big players already in the AI because it seems to be that the big tech companies that have dominated the internet revolution are also now dominating the AI space. So they have the access to data. They can afford to pay for the compute. So you see the same players, the Microsofts and the Googles, to lead in this game as well. It was Microsoft, which is partnership with OpenAI, that is now has a tremendous advantage. Obviously, we see also companies like Nvidia and the others in the semiconductor side enter the center of these AI battles because they are the ones that can provide the computing or the chips for the computing to train and run these AI models. But I think in many ways we are seeing the AI revolution amplify the existing power of the tech giants. And we have, I think, a lot of issues with the lack of level playing field, the idea that we know there are winners who are big winners here, and how can we make sure that the gains from the AI revolution would also be more equally spread across the countries, across the companies, the different stakeholders. And I think that is going to be a big challenge. And I think it's encouraging to see that there's a lot of efforts for international collaboration, because I think there's globally a sense that some of the threats, including potentially existential threats, are of the nature that we do need. We have no option but to collaborate across the borders. These AI technologies, applications are available on a global marketplace, and there are a lot of cost if we have regulatory loopholes, markets which basically can offset the benefits of even develop regulatory frameworks in some places. The idea that AI is central to military conflicts in the future has now invoked conversations that we need a kind of AI arms control treaty. But at the same time, again, going back to where we started today, the sort of geopolitics around technology are particularly contested around AI, because there is a sense that this is where the battles are won or lost. So it is hard to see any common agreement on moratorium in development of AI, because there's a sense that the others keep going. If we slow down, they will surpass us and we will never catch up. So I'm not as optimistic that we can have meaningful international collaboration on AI. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try. We shouldn't even try to get the low hanging fruit, but we are very far from having a binding, global, substantively meaningful AI treaty. So we probably need to pursue smaller, more incremental gains on our potential path there.
Yeah, maybe like the AI, I think, agreement on elections that happened recently, where a bunch of the tech companies came out and said that we'll try and coordinate and collaborate on making sure that the impact of AI and deepfakes and misinformation, especially in a year where so much of the world is going into domestic elections, that we can coordinate on. Maybe there are some small wins that one can hope for, even if there isn't a broader alignment given the geopolitical imperatives. I want to try and conclude our conversation on a more philosophical note.
Yeah.
I
Can I
think
just say
often,
one thing on what you just mentioned? Because look, we've always heard pledges by these tech companies. You don't need to regulate us. We will pledge to do the right thing. And it hasn't always worked out that way. So ultimately, I think one of the big takeaways in my book is that we do need the governments. We do need to make sure that the governments are not beholden to these companies, but these companies are beholden to the rules that are set by democratic governments, and that have the accountability and that have the responsibility to ensure that public interest is protected. So yes, I like to see the pledges. I like to see the companies offer us the rhetoric of their goodwill and commitment, but I don't think we can just trust that that alone is enough for us to ensure that there is no election interference. We will not have disinformation or AI undermine the electoral integrity. We do need laws to make sure that that is the case.
yeah, no, and I share your cynicism here. Of course, I think that there's many slip between cup and lip here. What you pledge is not necessarily what you implement or are even able to implement. But I want to move to and try and conclude our conversation, which has been fascinating, on a slightly more philosophical note. As I've been thinking a lot about these issues, there's often this sense that there are different philosophical approaches that have now clearly emerged around the world. Pockets that are, I think, as you also referring to, techno optimists, pockets that are techno pessimists. Some people are somewhere in the middle, what I call techno realists, right? Then there's yet another frame that one can think about, which we've almost touched upon many times in our conversation today, which is the sense of techno nationalism. That I'm going to use tech and my tech policy and strategy for my own national interest, strategic autonomy, and so on and so forth, versus techno globalism, right? where I'm looking for a slightly more broader set of global principles to base my tech strategy on as well, right? So this tension between techno nationalism and techno globalism. Of course, you have this real tension, I believe, between a human led tech development path versus humans adapting to whatever technology offers them today or whatever business models that tech firms put out there, right? Referring to, let's say, attention deficit issues that have come up because there are being all these business models that have come up from tech firms in the Silicon Valley space that are designed to hook you, right? So this tension between human first technology or tech dependent humans, right? So I want to get your views. How do you view some of these philosophical battles, I think, that we are seeing play out in the tech world?
Yeah, so ultimately, I think the philosophical battles are the ones that distinguish these three digital empires, and they different visions for what an ideal digital society looks like. And ultimately, I think there is the techno optimist philosophy that is the foundation of the digital economy as we know it today. The American model has been extremely influential in shaping our digital lives. But we also now see a real backlash that there is a recognition globally that that model no longer serves the challenges of today. And that's why I think we see this pushback to techno libertarianism and greater faith in this idea that the Europeans' commitment to human centric digital revolution is the one that ought to be at the center stage of the governments, not just in Europe, but in other parts of the world as well. So I think there is increasingly a view that we need to make sure that humans control technology and not it's not that technology can control and exploit us, but ultimately we need to make sure we can harness the benefit of technology to the benefit of humanity. And I think that is the key philosophy that partially explained why the European model has been very successful. There, the challenge is whether it can translate this philosophy into actual concrete market outcomes, whether it can be entrenched through institutionalized laws and regulations in a way that it actually shapes the way technologies are being developed and deployed. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges, because there, I think one warning that I leave my readers with in the digital empires is that the Chinese government does not have a hard time legislating. If China decides it's time to crack down on big tech, it is time to crack down on big tech. The US Congress is not able to produce legislation which would translate this shifting philosophy into actual concrete outcome. And the Europeans can legislate, but they have a hard time of enforcing their philosophy. And if that is the case, Anirudh, that's when we are forced to then concede that the digital economy is governed by authoritarian governments or the tech companies. And that would also mean that the true digital empires are the authoritarians or the tech companies. And that is a very disconcerting notion for anybody whose regulatory philosophy rests on this idea that we want to have a liberal democracy and the values philosophy is associated with that commitment to liberal democracy as a foundation of human engagement and our digital society.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it'd be very interesting to see. I think you've articulated the tensions very well and mapped them to the digital empires that we've spoken about over the last hour. And I think it'll be interesting to see whether the Europeans or let's say the India way can actually the philosophical underpinnings there, which are more in line with I think what you're hoping we'll end up with, whether they can develop successful business models that can drive economic success and economic gains as well, that emphasize privacy, data protection, and more rights based approaches. Because I think unless that philosophical approach is married to successful business models, my realist view of the world, unfortunately suggests that the economic and the geopolitical might win over the philosophical or the societal goals that I think you very nicely articulated. But this has been a great conversation, Anu. I've really enjoyed it. We end every podcast with two quick questions, which I always say I hope are simpler than the, I think, complex questions we've discussed over the last hour. But I often find that my guests are stumped at these two questions more. But let me ask you those. So one is just a recommendation for a book that you would recommend, other than your own or mine, for people, for viewers who are interested in the kinds of topics we've discussed at the intersection of tech, geopolitics, etc. And the second is a guest recommendation for someone we should have on the podcast as well.
Great. So there's so many great books about tech,
Oh,
but
good.
the
So don't
one,
limit yourself to one.
yes, no, I think let me choose one because we've talked a lot about geopolitics today. And I think that is really important. There's a great book called On the Theme of Empires, Underground Empire by Abe Newman and Henry Farrell.
I'm speaking to them soon.
Oh,
Yes.
that's so funny. Okay. I am glad that they are on your radar. It is a terrific book on how we weaponize these interdependencies in the global economy. When it comes to then the next guest, I would urge you to invite Angela Chang, who's a professor at the University of Hong Kong and an expert on Chinese platform regulation. She has a terrific new book coming out in a few months called High Wire: How China Regulates Big Tech and Governs its Platform Economy. I had a chance to read it as a manuscript when she was submitting it to Oxford University Press. It is a thrilling book, very exciting, very informative on what is going on with regulating the Chinese digital economy. And I think that would allow you to build on the conversation we had today and delve deeper into China. So I think she would be a terrific guest.
Great, perfect. Those are both amazing recommendations. Thank you so much for this. Thank you for taking the time today. It's been a great conversation. We've touched upon, I think, the entire world in many ways, or at least the key regions that are shaping this battle to regulate technology that you've written about in your book, The Digital Empire. So thank you again for being on the podcast today.
My pleasure. Thanks for a great conversation. Really enjoyed it.